What's up, everyone? I was making this video in reference to an issue I wanted to cover, and this issue is molestation in the black community and the issue of molestation as it relates to black men in specifically. Now, often the narrative of molestation as black people have faced is oftentimes in reference to black women having been raped in slavery and during the Jim Crow era, and even getting raped in prisons now. But what's not talked about as much is the issue of the molestation of black men, even starting from the slavery era all the way till now, and in its many forms. Now, during slavery, black men actually got raped by white men in a process called buck breaking, where they'd sodomize a man in front of his family. So, our country has a foundation of violating the bodies of black men and black women in every way possible. Not to mention a lot of the castrations of black men, which in my mind is sexual assault because it's assault on his sexual potency, his sexual prowess, and an ultimate violation of his body. And oftentimes it was done publicly as a show of dominance to try to take his humanity and his manhood away from him, to show the other slaves that they couldn't fight. And of course, these castrations went all the way into the Jim Crow era, where it was often the public spectacle of a black man being sexually assaulted and lynched. Going back to slavery, we have to understand that black men and boys were forced to breed and be sexual objects just like the women were. And that chances are, even though men are more physiologically aroused, they didn't like it either, and they also felt violated. Now, it is a given that they weren't forced to have a baby, but there was a separation of them from their children that they had with them, as the children were the property of the slave owners. So there were victims in this situation as well. But now, let's come to modern times about the sexualization and rape of black men being commodities for production. Let's talk about the police force in specific. A lot of these policies we have in prisons that police forces enact are nothing more than state sanctioned molestation, and they're extremely inappropriate. Stop and frisk, that's a good example of it. Policemen pretty much have the discretion to go up to anyone they want and violate them by touching them, feeling down their thighs, their legs, their private parts, and everything else. And a lot of times things like this escalate into public cavity searches because in a lot of instances these police officers are really just degenerates. They're just state funded degenerates. And you have a lot of cases of black men having even been strip searched and searched in public. And things haven't happened like that. As a matter of fact, there was a guy in Chicago who was sodomized by a screwdriver. Was a black man who was sodomized by a screwdriver with a screwdriver by a Chicago police officer who still has his job. So the police force play a big part in this molestation, and oftentimes the things that happen to black men are only taken into consideration when it's worst case scenario. He may have already been shot by the police, but you have to look at their plights before that. The things like stop and frisk that we even laugh at sometimes, which can take a sexual context because people are touching your private parts under the context that you might have contraband. And that's really ridiculous. And they might be getting some sort of sexual kick out of it because they are touching you. They have the discretion to touch you. And I might have said this before, but being able to do that with no repercussions, being allowed to do that in any sort of police force pretty much makes it so that police forces can be a breeding ground for degenerates, and it doesn't seem to matter as long as they contain the community. Another atrocious case was that of a man who was sodomized in New York with a broom handle by a police officer. Now, this police officer, the case was so egregious and blatantly atrocious that he got 30 years in prisons, but this is rare. And chances are this wasn't the first time that he'd done something like this. That man was probably a complete animal for his entire career. And there's an extremely animalistic culture within a lot of police forces, because all police forces are really kind of gangs as they relate to black communities. And that means they can pretty much do what they want in black communities with no real repercussions in a lot of instances. And this allows them to sexually assault people, and we do know they sexual assault women, which is important, but they also sexually assault men. Now, let's talk about on a social level boys being sexually assaulted by girls and things of that nature. Now, boys aren't seen as vulnerable as girls are, and in a lot of cases they aren't, but oftentimes, especially in black communities, there are multiple occasions where I hear of boys losing their virginity when they're like 10 to like 12-year-old girls and things like that, which is pretty bad in and of itself, or them being molested. Molestation is a big problem, but too often do they try to use these color purple and Tyler Perry narratives to make the women the primary victims of the entire thing, and of course the men and boys are the perpetrators. Even black boys are seen as being able to be perpetrators of these types of crimes, and that's where things like the Central Park Five come in. And the youngest one of those was 13 years old, but they got sent to an adult prison. They didn't even have any DNA evidence, but they just tortured them into a confession. And you have to wonder if the object of rape in prison came into them being coerced into a confession. Because, as I said before, these police, they're pretty sick. They don't mind telling, like, a little black boy, we'll give you a deal if you tell the truth, because you know you're gonna get raped in prison or something like that. They just don't really care. It's extremely sick. So you really have to take into account all of these things, and we really have to think about molestation as it relates to black boys, because black boys are often made into an adults and things like that. They're often, if I've noticed, if a young black boy is kind of attractive looking, people will already be saying, oh, he's gonna get a lot of girls, or even as he's gonna be sexy, or he's gonna get a lot of pussy and stuff like that. And it's kind of like, he's like 4, so why are you even saying that? And people don't have a problem with it because it's a boy, and black children have been overly sexualized, and men socially are seen as more sexual. So in a lot of cases, things that are looked at as inappropriate aren't really looked at as inappropriate when it comes to them. And of course, when it comes to black people, it's because of our because of our history here of being sexualized, it's multiplied by about 10. So I think that's a huge issue that needs to be looked at. And these are just some of my thoughts. I probably didn't get everything out, but it's just something I wanted to speak on.